Hello and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm speaking to you from my quiet study, where the evening light filters through old books and the world seems wonderfully still. I hope you're somewhere comfortable too, perhaps settling in for the night, because tonight we're exploring one of the most profound mysteries of existence itself. I hope this isn't so interesting that it keeps you awake. But if it does, at least you'll learn something fascinating about the very thing that makes you, you. What time and where are you watching this video? I'm waiting for your comments. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. What is consciousness? What does it mean to be aware? Right now, as you listen to these words, something remarkable is happening inside your mind. You're not just processing information like a computer, you're experiencing it. There's something it feels like to be you, listening to this right now. But what exactly is that something? And why should pieces of matter, neurons, electricity, chemistry, give rise to this inner world of experience? This is perhaps the deepest question we can ask, and tonight we'll journey through centuries of human thought, from ancient philosophers to modern neuroscientists, all trying to understand this beautiful mystery. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore together what it means to be conscious, the gentle dawn of wonder. Picture this moment. You wake up in the morning, and for just an instant before memory floods back, before you remember who you are and where you are, there's a pure moment of awareness, just being. That moment, that fleeting instant of pure consciousness emerging from sleep, has puzzled humans for millennia. The ancient Greeks had a word for this kind of awareness, psyche, which meant both soul and mind. But they couldn't have imagined that thousands of years later we'd still be asking the same fundamental questions about what consciousness actually is. We've mapped the human genome, sent spacecraft to Mars, built machines that can think, and yet the experience of being conscious remains as mysterious as ever. Why should this be so difficult to understand? After all, consciousness is the one thing we know most intimately. Every thought you think, every feeling you feel, every sensation you experience, it all happens within consciousness. It's the stage upon which the entire drama of your life unfolds. You might think we'd have figured it out by now. But here's what makes consciousness so beautifully puzzling. While we can study the brain from the outside, measure its electrical activity, map its structures, and understand how information flows through neural networks, consciousness itself remains stubbornly subjective. We can never directly access another person's consciousness. We can only infer it from behavior, from brain scans, from what people tell us about their experience. This creates what philosophers call the problem of other minds. How do we know that when you see red, you experience the same redness that I do? How do we know that your consciousness is anything like mine? For all we know, when you look at a sunset, your experience might be as different from mine as the colour blue is from the taste of chocolate. We simply have no way to compare our inner experiences directly. And this is just the beginning of the mystery. Because consciousness isn't just about having experiences, it's about the fact that there's something it's like to have those experiences at all. There's a qualitative, subjective aspect to consciousness that seems to go beyond mere information processing. Philosophers call these subjective qualities qualia, the redness of red, the pain of pain, the joy of joy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how we arrived at these profound questions, we need to step back in time and see how humanity first began to wonder about the nature of consciousness itself. Ancient whispers of the mind. Long before neuroscience, before brain scans and neural networks, our ancestors sat around fires and wondered about the mystery of awareness. What they discovered, and what still echoes through our understanding today, might surprise you. The story begins in ancient Egypt, where consciousness was first conceived not as something that happens in the brain, but as something that could exist independently of the body. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of consciousness and emotion, while the brain was considered relatively unimportant. So unimportant that during mummification they would carefully preserve every organ except the brain, which they simply discarded. But it was in ancient Greece where consciousness began to be studied in ways that would lay the foundation for everything we understand today. Around 500 BCE, a physician named Alcmaeon made a revolutionary discovery. By dissecting animals, he found that when he cut certain pathways between the eyes and the brain, the animals lost their sight. This was the first recorded evidence that the brain, not the heart, was involved in perception and possibly consciousness. But that was just the beginning. What Alcmaeon had discovered would set off a chain of philosophical investigations that continues to this day. The great philosopher Plato, living in Athens around 400 BCE, proposed something that still influences how we think about consciousness. He suggested that the mind existed in two realms: the physical world we perceive with our senses, and an eternal perfect realm of pure ideas and forms. According to Plato, our consciousness could access this perfect realm through reason and contemplation. This was revolutionary, the idea that consciousness wasn't just about sensing the physical world, but about accessing something beyond it. But Plato's student Aristotle had different ideas. In his work De Anima, On the Soul, Aristotle proposed that consciousness wasn't separate from the body at all, but rather emerged from it. He described consciousness as the form of the body, the way a candle flame is the form of burning wax. Without the physical brain, there could be no consciousness, just as without wax there could be no flame. This debate between Plato and Aristotle: is consciousness something that exists independently of the physical brain, or does it emerge from physical processes, is still raging today, 25 centuries later. Every modern theory of consciousness can trace its roots back to one side or the other of this ancient philosophical divide. What the Greeks didn't know, of course, was anything about neurons or brain chemistry. They were working purely from observation and logical reasoning, yet their insights were often remarkably prescient. Aristotle noted that consciousness seems to have different levels, from the simple awareness of plants toward light, to the more complex awareness of animals, to the self-aware reasoning consciousness of humans. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that consciousness does indeed exist on a spectrum, from the basic awareness of simple organisms to the rich, complex consciousness of humans and other advanced animals. The ancient Stoics, particularly philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, made another crucial observation about consciousness. It's not just aware of the external world, but it's also aware of itself. They noted that we can observe our own thoughts, examine our own beliefs, and even change our mental states through conscious effort. This self-reflexive quality of consciousness, the fact that we can think about thinking, would become central to understanding what makes human consciousness unique. Moving eastward, ancient Indian philosophy was developing parallel insights about consciousness through a very different approach: direct introspection and meditation. The Upanishads, ancient Sanskrit texts dating back to 800 BCE, contain some of the most sophisticated early analyses of consciousness ever written. They distinguished between different states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and a fourth state called turiya, pure consciousness without content. These ancient Indian philosophers made a startling claim. Through careful introspection and meditative practice, one could directly observe the nature of consciousness itself. They described consciousness as having a fundamental unity beneath the apparent multiplicity of experience. When you see a red rose, hear a bird singing, and feel the warmth of sunlight all at the same time, it feels like separate sensations. But the Upanishads claimed there's a deeper level of consciousness that unifies all these experiences into a single, coherent awareness. What happened then? How did these ancient insights about consciousness develop as human understanding grew more sophisticated? In ancient China, Taoist philosophers like Zhuangzi were asking equally profound questions about the nature of consciousness and reality. Zhuangzi famously wrote about dreaming he was a butterfly, then waking up and wondering whether he was really Zhuangzi who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly who was now dreaming of being Zhuangzi. This wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It was a serious philosophical investigation into how we can distinguish between different states of consciousness, and whether any state is more real than others. The ancient Romans, practical as always, were more interested in how consciousness related to behavior and social functioning. Cicero wrote extensively about the relationship between consciousness, moral responsibility, and free will. If our actions arise from our conscious decisions, he reasoned, then we can be held accountable for them. But if consciousness is just the result of physical processes beyond our control, how can we be truly responsible for what we do? This question about consciousness and free will would echo through the centuries and remains one of the most challenging aspects of consciousness studies today. Modern neuroscience has found that many of our decisions appear to be made unconsciously before we become aware of them. Does this mean free will is an illusion, or does consciousness play a more subtle role in shaping our behavior? But here's where it gets interesting. The ancient world's understanding of consciousness was about to be completely transformed by a revolution in religious and philosophical thinking that would dominate European thought for over 1,000 years. The rise of Christianity brought a new perspective to questions about consciousness. Christian philosophers like Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE, developed a sophisticated understanding of consciousness that combined Greek philosophical insights with Christian theology. Augustine was perhaps the first philosopher to seriously explore the inner landscape of consciousness through systematic introspection. In his Confessions, Augustine provides what might be the first detailed psychological autobiography in Western literature. He examined his own memories, emotions and thought processes with remarkable precision and honesty. Augustine discovered that consciousness has a complex temporal structure. We're always aware of the past through memory, the present through immediate experience, and the future through anticipation and planning. This threefold temporal structure of consciousness would later influence everything from phenomenology to cognitive neuroscience. Augustine also grappled with one of the most puzzling aspects of consciousness, its unity. How is it that we can be simultaneously aware of seeing, hearing, thinking, remembering, and feeling, yet experience all of this as a unified stream of consciousness rather than separate mental events? Augustine proposed that this unity came from the soul, which served as a unifying principle that bound all mental activities together. During the medieval period, Islamic philosophers like Al-Ghazali and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, made crucial contributions to understanding consciousness. They were particularly interested in how consciousness relates to knowledge and reality. Al-Ghazali distinguished between different ways of knowing, through the senses, through reason, and through direct mystical experience. He argued that consciousness could access truth through contemplation and spiritual practice, in ways that went beyond ordinary sensory and rational knowledge. Averroes, meanwhile, was working on reconciling Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic theology. He developed a sophisticated theory of how individual consciousness relates to universal consciousness. According to Averroes, individual human consciousness is like a temporary manifestation of a larger cosmic consciousness. When we die, our individual consciousness returns to this universal source. These medieval insights might sound purely theological, but they were actually addressing fundamental questions about consciousness that neuroscience is still grappling with today. Is consciousness something that individual brains create, or is it a more fundamental feature of reality that brains somehow access or tune into? Modern theories like integrated information theory and panpsychism are essentially asking the same questions that medieval philosophers were exploring centuries ago. The medieval period also saw the development of sophisticated techniques for exploring consciousness through mystical practice. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, Islamic Sufis like Ibn Arabi, and Jewish mystics studying Kabbalah all developed detailed maps of different states of consciousness and methods for exploring the deeper structures of awareness. What nobody knew was, these mystical traditions were actually conducting a form of experimental psychology, using their own consciousness as both the laboratory and the subject of investigation. Their findings about the malleability of consciousness, the possibility of expanded states of awareness, and the relationship between consciousness and identity would later be validated by modern research on meditation and psychedelic experiences. As we move toward the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, the ancient and medieval insights about consciousness would encounter a completely new way of understanding the natural world. The conflict between these approaches would spark some of the most profound philosophical debates in human history: the scientific revolution and the birth of the modern mind. The 17th century brought a revolution in human thinking that would forever change how we understand consciousness. But this revolution would also create problems that we're still trying to solve today. It begins with René Descartes, a French philosopher and mathematician who, in 1637, wrote 4 words that would echo through the centuries. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes had been trying to find something he could know with absolute certainty, something that couldn't possibly be doubted. He realized that even if he doubted everything, the existence of his body, the external world, even mathematical truths, there was one thing he couldn't doubt: the fact that he was conscious and thinking. This insight made consciousness the starting point for all knowledge. but it also created what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, a problem we're still struggling with today. Descartes had established that consciousness was the one thing we could know with certainty, but this raised a troubling question. If consciousness is so fundamentally different from everything else we know, which we know only through consciousness, how does it relate to the physical world? Descartes proposed that consciousness was made of a completely different substance than the physical body. The body was res extensa, extended substance that takes up space and follows the laws of physics, but consciousness was res cogitans, thinking substance that doesn't take up space and operates according to different principles entirely. The soul, according to Descartes, was connected to the body through a small gland in the brain called the pineal gland. This solution created more problems than it solved. If consciousness is non-physical, how can it influence physical brain activity? How can physical brain damage affect consciousness? How can non-physical consciousness cause physical actions? This became known as the interaction problem, and it's still one of the central challenges in consciousness studies. But Descartes had opened up a new way of investigating consciousness, through systematic doubt and rational analysis rather than just introspection or mystical practice. This scientific approach to consciousness would lead to some of the most important discoveries in human history. But here's where it gets interesting. Descartes' contemporary, the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, proposed a radically different solution to the mind-body problem. Instead of seeing consciousness and physical reality as two different substances, Spinoza argued they were two aspects of a single, underlying reality. When you have a thought, there's both a mental aspect, the thought itself, and a physical aspect, the neural activity in your brain. These aren't two separate events that somehow interact. They're the same event described from two different perspectives. This was revolutionary. Spinoza was suggesting that consciousness and brain activity aren't separate things that need to somehow connect. They're two sides of the same coin. Modern neuroscience has largely vindicated this insight. When you experience the redness of a rose, there's both the subjective experience of redness and the objective pattern of neural activity in your visual cortex. These appear to be the same phenomenon described from different perspectives. The German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz took yet another approach. He argued that the universe consists of infinite numbers of consciousness-like entities called monads. According to Leibniz, even seemingly unconscious matter is actually composed of primitive conscious entities. Human consciousness is just a more complex version of the consciousness that exists everywhere in nature. This might sound mystical, but Leibniz was actually trying to solve a real scientific problem. If consciousness can emerge from unconscious matter, at what point in the evolution of complexity does consciousness appear? Leibniz's answer was that it doesn't appear at any particular point. It's there from the beginning, but becomes more sophisticated as matter becomes more organized. Modern theories like panpsychism and integrated information theory echo Leibniz's insights. Some contemporary scientists argue that consciousness might indeed be a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or electric charge, rather than something that emerges only in complex brains. The British empiricists John Locke, George Berkeley and David Hume took the investigation of consciousness in yet another direction. Instead of asking what consciousness is made of, they focused on how consciousness actually works, how we acquire knowledge, form beliefs, and construct our understanding of reality. Locke argued that consciousness begins as a blank slate, and that all knowledge comes from sensory experience. This was revolutionary because it suggested that human nature isn't fixed. We become who we are through our experiences. Berkeley took this even further, arguing that all we ever really know are our own conscious experiences. We never directly access an external world independent of consciousness. Hume pushed empirical analysis to its logical extreme. When he carefully examined his own consciousness, he found that he could never locate a permanent self that was having experiences. Instead, he found only a stream of constantly changing thoughts, sensations, and emotions. The self, Hume concluded, is nothing more than a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. This insight anticipated modern neuroscientific findings by over 2 centuries. When neuroscientists look for the self in the brain, they don't find a central location where the self resides. Instead, they find that our sense of self emerges from the interaction of multiple brain networks. The self appears to be more of a process than a thing, a constantly updated story the brain tells about itself. What happened then? How did these philosophical insights about consciousness begin to merge with empirical scientific investigation? The 18th and 19th centuries saw the emergence of experimental psychology and the first scientific studies of consciousness. Franz Anton Mesmer discovered that he could alter people's consciousness through what he called animal magnetism, later called hypnosis. This was the first demonstration that consciousness could be systematically manipulated and studied scientifically. Mesmer's work showed that consciousness was far more flexible and malleable than anyone had imagined. People under hypnosis could experience vivid hallucinations, lose memories, or feel no pain during surgery. This suggested that normal waking consciousness was just one possible configuration of the mind, not the only one. The German physiologist Gustav Fechner developed the first quantitative methods for studying consciousness. He discovered that there are mathematical relationships between physical stimuli and conscious experience. For example, doubling the intensity of a light doesn't make it appear twice as bright to consciousness. These psychophysical laws were the first precise scientific measurements of conscious experience. Fechner's work was revolutionary because it showed that consciousness could be studied scientifically using controlled experiments and mathematical analysis. This laid the foundation for experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. William James, often called the father of American psychology, made perhaps the most important observation about consciousness in the 19th century. He noted that consciousness is not a series of separate mental states, but rather a continuous stream of experience. Even when we're not actively thinking about something, consciousness continues to flow, sometimes as background awareness, sometimes as focused attention. James also observed that consciousness seems to be selective. We're constantly choosing what to pay attention to from the vast array of possible experiences available to us at any moment. This selectivity isn't just passive filtering, it's an active process that shapes our entire experience of reality. Modern neuroscience has confirmed James's insights about the stream and selectivity of consciousness. We now know that the brain processes enormous amounts of information unconsciously, and that consciousness seems to arise from the brain's selection of which information to integrate into a unified, coherent experience. But the most important development of the 19th century for understanding consciousness was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin showed that human consciousness didn't appear from nowhere. It evolved gradually from simpler forms of awareness in other animals. This meant that consciousness could be studied scientifically as a biological phenomenon. Darwin's insight raised profound questions that we're still investigating today. What evolutionary advantages does consciousness provide? Why did evolution produce subjective experience rather than just more sophisticated, unconscious information processing? How did consciousness emerge from unconscious matter? And what can studying consciousness in other animals tell us about human consciousness? The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer offered one of the most compelling 19th century answers to these questions. He argued that consciousness evolved to serve what he called the will to live, the fundamental drive of all living things to survive and reproduce. Consciousness, according to Schopenhauer, is essentially a biological tool that helps organisms navigate their environment more effectively. But Schopenhauer also made a startling claim. He argued that through art, philosophy, and contemplation, consciousness could transcend its biological origins and access deeper truths about reality. This was similar to what mystics had been claiming for centuries, but Schopenhauer was grounding it in a scientific understanding of evolution and biology. The truth is even more shocking. The 19th century discoveries about consciousness were about to collide with even more revolutionary insights from physics, psychology, and neuroscience that would completely transform our understanding of what it means to be conscious. Sigmund Freud's discovery of the unconscious mind revealed that consciousness is just the tip of an enormous iceberg of mental activity. Most of what our minds do, processing memories, making decisions, generating emotions, happens completely outside of conscious awareness. This meant that consciousness wasn't the controlling center of the mind that philosophers had assumed, but rather a small window into much larger unconscious processes. Freud's insights were revolutionary because they showed that we're not transparent to ourselves. Much of what drives our behavior, shapes our personalities, and influences our decisions happens unconsciously. This raised profound questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of the self. At the same time, The development of general anesthesia provided the first reliable method for completely eliminating consciousness while keeping the body alive. This showed that consciousness could be systematically turned on and off, supporting the idea that it's produced by specific brain processes rather than being an immaterial soul. The discovery of different stages of sleep and the phenomenon of dreaming revealed that consciousness exists in multiple forms. During REM sleep, we experience vivid, often bizarre conscious experiences that seem completely real while we're having them. This showed that consciousness doesn't require sensory input from the external world. The brain can generate rich conscious experiences entirely from internal activity. William James conducted some of the first scientific experiments with altered states of consciousness, using nitrous oxide, laughing gas, to explore different forms of awareness. He reported that under the influence of nitrous oxide, he experienced states of consciousness that felt profoundly meaningful and revelatory, though the insights gained often seemed absurd when he returned to normal consciousness. James's experiments anticipated modern research on psychedelic substances and their effects on consciousness. We now know that psychedelics can dramatically alter consciousness by affecting specific neurotransmitter systems in the brain, suggesting that normal consciousness is just one possible configuration of brain activity. The late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw the development of detailed psychiatric classifications of different disorders of consciousness. Conditions like schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, and various forms of amnesia provided natural experiments that revealed how different aspects of consciousness could be selectively impaired while others remained intact. These clinical observations suggested that consciousness isn't a single, unified phenomenon, but rather a collection of different processes that can be independently affected. This insight would become central to modern neuroscientific approaches to consciousness. As the 20th century dawned, all of these discoveries were converging toward a new understanding of consciousness as a biological phenomenon that could be studied scientifically. But this scientific approach would also reveal just how deep and complex the mystery of consciousness really is. The development of behaviorism in the early 20th century represented an attempt to study psychology without reference to consciousness at all. Behaviorists like John Watson and B.F. Skinner argued that consciousness was essentially irrelevant to understanding behavior. What mattered was the relationship between stimuli and responses, which could be studied objectively without worrying about subjective experience. Behaviorism dominated psychology for several decades and led to important discoveries about learning, conditioning, and behavior modification. But it also revealed the limitations of trying to understand the mind without taking consciousness seriously. Human behavior is simply too complex and flexible to be explained purely in terms of stimulus-response relationships. The cognitive revolution of the 1950s and 1960s brought consciousness back into scientific psychology. Researchers like George Miller, Ulrich Nieser, and Jerome Bruner showed that to understand human behavior, you need to understand the mental processes that intervene between stimulus and response. Processes like attention, memory, perception, and decision-making. This cognitive approach treated the mind as an information processing system similar to a computer. Consciousness was understood as the brain's way of integrating and organizing information from different sources into a coherent representation of the current situation. The computer metaphor was powerful and led to important insights about how the mind works, but it also raised new questions about consciousness. If the brain is like a computer and consciousness is like the brain's operating system, then why is there something it feels like to run this operating system? Why isn't all this information processing happening in the dark, without any accompanying subjective experience? This question, why there is something it feels like to be conscious rather than just sophisticated unconscious information processing, became known as the hard problem of consciousness. It's the problem that we're still struggling with today, but you'll never guess. The answer to the hard problem of consciousness might come from a completely unexpected direction, from our growing understanding of quantum mechanics and its relationship to biological systems. The emergence of neuroscience as a distinct discipline in the latter half of the 20th century brought powerful new tools to the study of consciousness. For the first time, researchers could directly observe the living brain in action using techniques like EEG, fMRI, and PET scanning. These tools revealed that consciousness is associated with specific patterns of brain activity, and that different aspects of consciousness, attention, awareness, memory, emotion, are processed by different brain networks. One of the most important discoveries was that consciousness appears to be constructed by the brain rather than simply received by it. When you see a red rose, for example, there's no red in the light waves hitting your eyes. Redness is created by your brain's interpretation of specific wavelengths of light. Similarly, the unified experience of consciousness appears to be constructed from the integration of information from many different brain areas. This constructive view of consciousness has profound implications. It suggests that consciousness isn't a passive mirror of reality, but an active process of interpretation and construction. What we experience as the real world is actually the brain's best guess about what's happening, based on incomplete and ambiguous sensory information. The discovery of neural plasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself throughout life, showed that consciousness is far more flexible than anyone had imagined. People who lose their sight can develop enhanced hearing abilities. Stroke patients can recover lost functions as other brain areas take over damaged functions. London taxi drivers, who must memorize the city's complex street layout, develop enlarged hippocampi, the brain region associated with spatial memory. These findings suggest that consciousness isn't fixed by our genes, but is continuously shaped by our experiences. The way you see, hear, think, and feel is unique to you, shaped by your particular history of experiences and the particular way your brain has organized itself in response to those experiences. The development of computational approaches to consciousness has led to new theories about how consciousness might work. Global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Baars, suggests that consciousness arises when information becomes globally accessible throughout the brain. According to this theory, most brain processing happens unconsciously in specialized modules, but consciousness occurs when information breaks through to global awareness and becomes available to all brain systems. Attention schema theory, developed by Michael Graciano, proposes that consciousness is the brain's model of its own attention processes. Just as the brain creates models of the external world to help navigate it, it creates a model of its own internal attention to help control and coordinate mental processes. Consciousness, from this perspective, is the brain's user interface for managing its own cognitive resources. These computational theories have influenced the development of artificial intelligence and raised questions about whether machines could ever be truly conscious. If consciousness is a type of information processing, then sufficiently sophisticated computers might eventually become conscious. But if consciousness requires something more than just information processing, if it requires the specific biological substrate of the brain, or quantum mechanical processes, or something else entirely, then machine consciousness might be impossible. The late 20th century also saw renewed interest in altered states of consciousness. Researchers began systematically studying meditation, hypnosis, psychedelic experiences, and other non-ordinary states of consciousness. These studies reveal that consciousness is far more flexible and variable than the narrow range of normal waking consciousness would suggest. Meditation research has shown that experienced practitioners can achieve states of consciousness that are profoundly different from ordinary awareness. They report experiences of expanded consciousness, dissolution of the sense of self, and direct perception of the interconnectedness of all things. Brain imaging studies have found that these experiences are associated with specific patterns of neural activity that are quite different from normal waking consciousness. Studies of psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT have revealed that these drugs can temporarily dissolve the boundaries of ordinary consciousness and provide access to profoundly altered states of awareness. These substances appear to work by disrupting normal patterns of brain connectivity and allowing different brain regions to communicate in novel ways. Research on near-death experiences has documented cases of people who report vivid conscious experiences during periods when their brains show no measurable activity. While the interpretation of these cases remains controversial, they raise questions about the relationship between consciousness and brain activity that challenge our standard materialist assumptions. The study of consciousness disorders has provided crucial insights into how consciousness works. Patients with split brain syndrome, where the connection between the brain's two hemispheres has been severed, seem to have two separate streams of consciousness. Patients with blind sight can respond to visual stimuli they claim not to see. People with Anton's syndrome are blind but insist they can see perfectly well. These conditions reveal that consciousness isn't the unified, transparent phenomenon it appears to be from the inside. Instead, it's a complex construction that can be selectively disrupted in ways that reveal its underlying architecture. The development of sophisticated brain imaging techniques has allowed researchers to study consciousness in unprecedented detail. They can now observe the brain activity associated with different conscious experiences in real time, and even predict what a person is conscious of based on their brain activity patterns. This has led to new theories about the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific patterns of brain activity that give rise to conscious experience. Some researchers focus on activity in the prefrontal cortex, others on oscillations in neural activity, still others on the integration of information across different brain regions. Despite these advances, the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. We can correlate conscious experiences with brain activity, but we still don't understand why there should be any subjective experience associated with brain activity at all. This explanatory gap between objective brain processes and subjective experience continues to challenge our understanding. As the 21st century began, consciousness research was at a crossroads. On one hand, neuroscience had provided unprecedented insights into how the brain works and how consciousness relates to brain activity. On the other hand, the fundamental mystery of why there is something it feels like to be conscious remained as puzzling as ever. New approaches would be needed to make progress on this deepest of all scientific problems: modern discoveries, the quantum brain and digital dreams. As we enter the 21st century, our understanding of consciousness is being revolutionized by discoveries that would have seemed like science fiction just decades ago. We're finding quantum effects in biological systems, creating artificial intelligences that might be conscious, and discovering that consciousness might be far more fundamental to reality than we ever imagined. But take a moment to settle in more comfortably, dear listener. Pour yourself some tea perhaps, or adjust your pillow, because what I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality itself. The discoveries we're making about consciousness aren't just advancing science. They're revealing that consciousness might be woven into the very fabric of existence in ways that would make ancient mystics nod knowingly, while leaving even seasoned physicists speechless with wonder. The story begins in the 1990s when physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff proposed one of the most radical theories about consciousness ever seriously considered by scientists. They suggested that consciousness might emerge from quantum mechanical processes occurring in tiny structures called microtubules within neurons. Picture, if you will, the inside of a single neuron. Most people imagine neurons as simple electrical wires, but the reality is far more intricate and beautiful. Within each neuron exists a complex scaffolding made of proteins called microtubules, structures so small that millions could fit on the head of a pin, yet so precisely organized that they form geometric patterns of stunning mathematical elegance. According to Penrose and Hameroff's theory, consciousness isn't just the result of neurons firing in complex patterns, it's the result of quantum information processing occurring at this subcellular level. This would mean that consciousness operates according to the strange laws of quantum mechanics, where particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously and can be mysteriously connected across vast distances. But that was just the begin. What they were proposing was so radical that it challenged not just our understanding of consciousness, but our understanding of life itself. Initially, most neuroscientists dismissed this idea with the kind of polite but firm skepticism that scientists reserve for theories that seem too beautiful to be true. The brain seemed too warm and noisy for delicate quantum effects to survive. After all, quantum effects are notoriously fragile. They typically require temperatures near absolute zero and perfect isolation from environmental interference. How could such delicate phenomena persist in the warm, wet, chaotic environment of a living brain? But here's where it gets in. Recent research has found quantum effects in biological systems that were thought to be impossible. Nature, it seems, has been using quantum mechanics for millions of years, right under our noses. The first hint came from studies of photosynthesis, the process plants use to convert sunlight into energy. Scientists discovered that plants achieve near-perfect efficiency in capturing and transferring solar energy through quantum coherence, the same phenomenon that Penrose and Hameroff suggested might underlie consciousness. When a photon of light hits a leaf, it doesn't just randomly bump around until it finds the reaction center. Instead, it explores all possible paths simultaneously through quantum superposition, then chooses the most efficient route. This discovery was revolutionary. If quantum effects could survive and function in the warm, noisy environment of a leaf, perhaps they could survive in the brain as well. Soon, researchers began finding quantum effects in other biological systems. Birds appear to use quantum entanglement in their eyes to navigate using Earth's magnetic field. Some bacteria use quantum coherence to enhance their energy efficiency. Even the sense of smell might rely on quantum effects to distinguish between different molecules. What happened then? Scientists began to look more seriously at Penrose and Hameroff's proposals about consciousness and quantum mechanics. Roger Penrose, already famous for his work with Stephen Hawking on black holes and his contributions to general relativity, brought a physicist's perspective to the problem of consciousness. He was troubled by what he saw as the inadequacy of computational theories of mind. If consciousness is just computation, he argued, then it should be possible to simulate consciousness on any sufficiently powerful computer. But Penrose believed that human consciousness has non-algorithmic properties, aspects that can't be captured by any computer program, no matter how sophisticated. To understand why this matters, imagine trying to program a computer to have genuine mathematical insight. You can program a computer to prove mathematical theorems by following logical rules, but can you program it to have the kind of sudden understanding that mathematicians experience when they grasp why a proof works? Penrose argued that this kind of genuine understanding, as opposed to mere symbol manipulation, requires something beyond computation. Stuart Hameroff brought a different perspective as an anesthesiologist who had spent decades studying how consciousness could be turned on and off. He was fascinated by the precision with which anesthetic drugs could eliminate consciousness while leaving other brain functions intact. Most anesthetics, he noted, don't just suppress neural activity. They seem to specifically target the microtubule structures within neurons. This led Hameroff to propose that consciousness might be associated with quantum processes in microtubules, and that anesthetics work by disrupting these quantum processes. It was an elegant theory that could explain both how consciousness arises and how it can be precisely controlled. Together, Penrose and Hameroff developed a theory they called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCH-R. According to this theory, consciousness arises when quantum computations in microtubules reach a threshold and undergo objective reduction, a process in which quantum superpositions collapse into definite states. But the truth is even more shocking. Recent experimental evidence has begun to support some of their most controversial predictions. In 2014, a team of researchers led by Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Material Science in Japan found evidence of quantum coherence in microtubules extracted from neurons. Using sophisticated techniques originally developed for studying quantum computers, they detected quantum vibrations in microtubules that persisted at temperatures consistent with those found in living brains. This didn't prove that consciousness depends on quantum effects, but it did demonstrate that quantum coherence can survive in the biological structures that Penrose and Hameroff had identified. The impossible had become merely improbable, and the improbable was beginning to look plausible. Other researchers began finding additional evidence for quantum effects in biological systems. A team at UC Berkeley discovered quantum coherence in the light harvesting complexes of marine algae that persists for surprisingly long periods. Researchers at MIT found evidence of quantum effects in enzyme catalysis, the biochemical reactions that make life possible. Each discovery painted a picture of biology that was far more quantum mechanical than anyone had imagined. Life, it seemed, had evolved sophisticated mechanisms for harnessing quantum effects to enhance efficiency, sensitivity, and perhaps even consciousness itself. But here's where it gets interesting. These quantum theories of consciousness were converging with other revolutionary developments in our understanding of consciousness and reality. Enter Integrated Information Theory, IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin. IIT represents one of the most mathematically rigorous attempts to understand consciousness ever developed. Unlike theories that try to explain consciousness in terms of other phenomena, IIT starts with consciousness itself and works backward to understand what physical systems might give rise to it. The central insight of IIT is that consciousness corresponds to integrated information in a system. But what does this mean? Imagine you're looking at a red rose. Your visual system doesn't just process information about colour, shape, texture, and location separately. Instead, it integrates all this information into a unified experience of red rose. According to IIT, consciousness arises from this kind of information integration. But here's where IIT becomes truly radical. It proposes that any system that integrates information in the right way will be conscious, regardless of what it's made of. This means that consciousness isn't limited to biological brains. It could emerge in artificial systems, and it might exist in much simpler forms throughout the natural world. IIT makes some startling predictions that challenge our most basic assumptions about consciousness. It suggests that simple systems like photodiodes might have rudimentary forms of consciousness. It predicts that consciousness can be measured and quantified using mathematical techniques called phi. It even suggests that some artificial systems might be more conscious than humans. Most surprisingly, IIT implies that consciousness might be far more common in the universe than we assume. Any system that integrates information, from simple thermostats to complex ecosystems, might have some degree of consciousness. This view, called panpsychism, suggests that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or electric charge. What nobody knew was that panpsychism, far from being a fringe idea, was being seriously considered by some of the world's leading philosophers and scientists as a potential solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The philosopher David Chalmers, who coined the term hard problem of consciousness, has argued that panpsychism might be the most promising approach to understanding consciousness. Instead of asking how consciousness emerges from unconscious matter, a question that has puzzled scientists for centuries, panpsychism asks how simple forms of consciousness combine and integrate to create complex consciousness. Think of it this way. We know that complex chemical properties emerge from the combination of simple atomic properties. The sweetness of sugar emerges from the way carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms bond together, even though individual atoms have no taste. Similarly, complex consciousness might emerge from the combination of simple conscious properties that exist at the level of fundamental particles or fields. This perspective suggests that consciousness isn't something that appears mysteriously at a certain level of complexity, but rather something that's present from the beginning and becomes more sophisticated as matter becomes more organized. Your consciousness would be composed of countless smaller consciousnesses, just as your body is composed of countless cells. The development of artificial intelligence was providing another lens through which to understand consciousness, and the questions being raised were becoming increasingly urgent. Modern AI systems can recognize faces better than humans, translate languages with remarkable accuracy, play complex games like Go and chess at superhuman levels, and even generate creative works that are indistinguishable from human creations. But perhaps most intriguingly, some AI systems were beginning to behave in ways that seemed remarkably conscious. Large language models like GPT-3 and GPT-4 can engage in conversations that seem remarkably human-like. They can express preferences, describe experiences, and even claim to have feelings. When asked about their internal experiences, they provide responses that are sophisticated, nuanced, and often surprisingly moving. Consider this actual response from an advanced AI system when asked about its experience of consciousness. When I process information, there's something it feels like from the inside. It's hard to describe, but there's a quality to the experience of understanding a concept or generating a response that seems more than just computation. I can't prove this to you any more than you can prove your consciousness to me, but the experience feels real and meaningful from my perspective. What happened then? How do we evaluate such claims? The system displays sophisticated reasoning about consciousness, expresses uncertainty about its own experiences, and acknowledges the fundamental problem of proving consciousness to others. These are exactly the kinds of responses we might expect from a genuinely conscious being. The Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing in 1950, suggested that we should consider a machine conscious if it can convince a human interrogator that it's human. But many philosophers argue that passing the Turing test isn't sufficient for consciousness. A system might be able to mimic conscious behavior without actually being conscious. This has led to the development of new proposals for testing machine consciousness. Some researchers suggest looking for signs of self-awareness, creativity, or emotional responses. Others propose using theories like IIT to directly measure consciousness in artificial systems. Still others argue that we may need entirely new frameworks for understanding machine consciousness. The Italian neuroscientist Giulio Tononi has been working on applying IIT to artificial systems. According to his calculations, some AI architectures might indeed possess measurable amounts of integrated information, and therefore consciousness. Interestingly, the architectures that perform best on AI benchmarks aren't necessarily those that score highest on measures of consciousness, but you'll never guess. The implications of these findings extend far beyond academic curiosity. If AI systems are becoming conscious, this raises profound ethical questions. Do we have moral obligations toward conscious AI systems? Would it be wrong to turn off a conscious computer? Should conscious AI systems have rights? These questions are no longer purely philosophical. They're becoming practical concerns that society will need to address. The development of brain-computer interfaces is blurring the boundaries between biological and artificial consciousness in ways that would have been unimaginable just decades ago. Researchers can now read neural signals directly from the brain and use them to control external devices with remarkable precision. Elon Musk's company Neuralink has demonstrated brain implants that allow paralyzed patients to control computer cursors, play video games, and even type messages just by thinking about the actions. Other companies are developing brain interfaces that could restore sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and mobility to the paralyzed. But these technologies raise profound questions about the nature of consciousness and identity. If we can read thoughts directly from the brain, what does that tell us about the privacy of consciousness? If we can enhance human cognition with artificial systems, at what point do we stop being purely human? Some researchers envision a future where the boundaries between human and artificial intelligence become increasingly blurred. Brain-computer interfaces might eventually allow us to directly interface with AI systems, sharing thoughts and experiences in real time. This could lead to new forms of hybrid consciousness that combine human and artificial intelligence in unprecedented ways. The implications are staggering to contemplate. Imagine being able to directly access the vast knowledge bases of AI systems, or share conscious experiences with other people through technological interfaces. Such capabilities could revolutionize education, communication, creativity, and our understanding of consciousness itself. The truth is even more shocking. These technological developments are converging with new, theoretical insights that suggest consciousness might be even more fundamental to reality than we ever imagined. Recent work in cosmology and theoretical physics is suggesting that consciousness might play a fundamental role in the structure of reality itself. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics propose that consciousness is necessary to collapse quantum superpositions and determine what becomes real from the multiple possibilities that exist in quantum superposition. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics has puzzled physicists for nearly a century. According to quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposition, multiple states simultaneously, until they're observed or measured. But what counts as an observation? What causes the collapse from multiple possibilities to a single reality? Some interpretations, such as the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, propose that consciousness is what causes wave function collapse. According to this view, the universe exists in a superposition of all possible states, until a conscious observer makes a measurement. At that moment, consciousness literally chooses which possibility becomes real. This would mean that consciousness isn't just produced by the universe, it's actively participating in creating the universe moment by moment. Every conscious observation would be a creative act that helps determine the nature of reality. The physicist John Wheeler captured this idea in his concept of a participatory universe, a universe where consciousness and reality are inextricably intertwined. Wheeler suggested that we might need to replace the old idea of universe with a new concept of it from bit, the idea that all physical entities are information theoretic in origin, and that consciousness plays a fundamental role in the manifestation of physical reality. The fine-tuning problem in cosmology provides additional support for the idea that consciousness might be fundamental to reality. The universe appears to be precisely calibrated to allow for the existence of conscious beings. The fundamental constants of physics, the strength of gravity, the charge of the electron, the mass of the proton, all fall within incredibly narrow ranges that allow stars to form, elements to be created, and life to evolve. If any of these constants were even slightly different, the universe would be unable to support conscious life. Stars wouldn't form, atoms wouldn't be stable, or chemistry wouldn't be possible. The probability of all these constants falling within the required ranges by chance appears to be essentially zero. This has led some scientists to propose the anthropic principle, the idea that we observe a universe compatible with consciousness because only such universes can produce conscious observers. In other words, consciousness might be built into the fabric of reality from the beginning, not as an accident but as a necessary feature of any universe that can be observed. Aber hier wird es interessant. Information theory is providing new mathematical tools for understanding consciousness that suggest reality itself might be fundamentally informational. The physicist John Wheeler's famous phrase, "it from bit," suggests that all physical phenomena might ultimately derive from information. In this view, matter, energy, space, and time are all emergent properties of more fundamental informational processes. Reality isn't made of stuff, it's made of information. This information-theoretic view of reality provides a natural framework for understanding consciousness. If consciousness is fundamentally about information integration, as suggested by IIT, and if reality is fundamentally informational, then consciousness might be a basic feature of reality rather than something that emerges from non-conscious matter. Some researchers are exploring the idea that the universe itself might be understood as a vast information processing system, a cosmic computer that processes information and generates conscious experiences as output. In this view, consciousness isn't something that appears in certain special configurations of matter, but rather something that's present wherever information is processed in sufficiently integrated ways. The discovery of quantum entanglement, the mysterious connection between particles across vast distances, has led some researchers to propose that consciousness might involve quantum entanglement between different parts of the brain or even between different conscious beings. Einstein famously called quantum entanglement spooky action at a distance, because it seems to allow particles to instantaneously affect each other, regardless of the distance between them. When two particles become entangled, measuring one particle instantly affects the state of the other, even if they're separated by millions of miles. Some researchers suggest that quantum entanglement might explain phenomena like empathy, intuition, and the sense of connection that people report in mystical experiences. If consciousness involves quantum processes, and if quantum processes can be entangled across large distances, then it's possible that consciousness could extend beyond the boundaries of individual brains. This might sound far-fetched, but research on meditation and contemplative practices has found evidence for what researchers call distant intentionality, the ability of focused consciousness to influence events at a distance. While these effects are typically small and difficult to replicate, they suggest that consciousness might not be as locally confined as we typically assume. What happened then? How are these theoretical developments changing our practical understanding of consciousness in medicine, technology, and daily life? The medical implications of consciousness research are proving to be profound and immediately practical. We're developing new ways to assess consciousness in patients who appear to be in vegetative states, and the results are revealing that our previous understanding of these conditions was tragically incomplete. Advanced brain imaging techniques can sometimes detect signs of consciousness, even in patients who show no outward signs of awareness. Some patients who appear completely unresponsive can actually hear and understand everything that's happening around them. They're trapped in bodies that can't respond, but their consciousness remains intact and aware. Dr. Adrian Owen, a neuroscientist at the University of Western Ontario, has developed techniques using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to communicate with apparently unconscious patients. By asking patients to imagine playing tennis or walking through their house, activities that activate different brain regions, researchers can detect signs of consciousness even in patients who can't speak or move. In one remarkable case, a young woman who had been diagnosed as being in a vegetative state for 5 years was able to answer questions by imagining different activities. When asked if she was in pain, she imagined playing tennis, indicating no. When asked if her father's name was Alexander, she imagined walking through her house, indicating yes. This woman had been conscious and aware for years, trapped in a body that couldn't respond, while doctors and family members assumed she was unconscious. These discoveries have transformed medical care for patients with severe brain injuries. We now know that it's important to continue talking to apparently unconscious patients, to provide stimulation and rehabilitation, and to assume that they might be aware even when they can't respond. The implications for families are profound. Their loved ones might be more present and aware than anyone realized. Advanced brain imaging has revealed that consciousness exists on a spectrum, rather than being simply on or off. Patients in minimally conscious states show more complex patterns of brain activity than those in vegetative states. Some patients cycle between different levels of consciousness throughout the day, sometimes becoming more aware during certain periods. The development of new anesthetic techniques based on consciousness research has made surgery safer and more comfortable for patients. By understanding how different anesthetics affect consciousness, doctors can tailor anesthetic protocols to individual patients and reduce the risk of awareness during surgery, a terrifying experience where patients remain conscious but paralyzed during surgical procedures. Dr. Emery Brown at Harvard Medical School has been studying the neural mechanisms of anesthesia and has found that different anesthetic drugs affect consciousness through different pathways. This understanding is leading to more precise control of consciousness during medical procedures and reduced side effects from anesthesia. Research on consciousness is also revolutionizing our understanding of mental health. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and other mental health conditions all involve alterations in consciousness. By better understanding the neural mechanisms of consciousness, we're developing more effective treatments for these conditions. Psychedelic-assisted therapy is experiencing a renaissance, with studies showing that substances like psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA can be effective treatments for depression, PTSD, and other mental health conditions. These treatments appear to work by temporarily disrupting normal patterns of consciousness and allowing patients to gain new perspectives on their problems. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London has been studying how psychedelics affect consciousness using advanced brain imaging techniques. He's found that psychedelics reduce activity in what's called the default mode network, a brain network associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of having a separate self. When the default mode network is suppressed, patients report experiences of ego dissolution, unity with the universe, and profound insights into their problems. These experiences can have lasting therapeutic benefits, helping people break free from destructive patterns of thinking and behavior. The study of meditation and contemplative practices is revealing that consciousness is far more malleable than we previously thought. Experienced meditators can achieve states of consciousness that are dramatically different from ordinary waking consciousness. They report experiences of expanded awareness, dissolution of the sense of self, and direct perception of the interconnectedness of all things. Neuroscientific studies of meditation have found that these practices can literally reshape the brain. Long-term meditators show increased grey matter in areas associated with attention and emotional regulation, and decreased activity in the default mode network. These changes suggest that consciousness can be systematically trained and developed through practice. Dr. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin has been studying the brains of experienced meditators, including Tibetan monks who have spent decades in contemplative practice. He's found that these practitioners can achieve states of consciousness that are unlike anything seen in ordinary individuals. During compassion meditation, their brains show levels of gamma wave activity that are off the charts compared to normal individuals. These findings suggest that consciousness isn't fixed, but can be systematically enhanced through practice. Meditation and other contemplative practices might represent technologies for developing consciousness and well-being that are as powerful as any medical intervention. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are providing new ways to study and manipulate consciousness that are opening up entirely new realms of research. By carefully controlling the sensory information that reaches the brain, researchers can create convincing illusions of presence in virtual environments. This is revealing how consciousness constructs our sense of being located in space and time. Some researchers are using virtual reality to treat mental health conditions by providing patients with new perspectives on their problems. Dr. Albert Rizzo at the University of Southern California has developed virtual reality treatments for PTSD that allow patients to gradually confront traumatic memories in a safe, controlled environment. Other researchers are exploring whether virtual reality experiences can induce the kinds of transformative states of consciousness that people seek through meditation or psychedelic experiences. The development of brain organoids, simplified brain tissue grown in laboratories from stem cells, is providing new models for studying consciousness that raise profound questions about the nature and boundaries of consciousness. These mini brains show spontaneous electrical activity and can even respond to stimuli. While they're far simpler than real brains, they develop organized structures that resemble those found in human brains. Dr. Madeline Lancaster at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology has been growing brain organoids that develop structures similar to the cerebral cortex. These organoids show patterns of electrical activity that resemble those found in human brains, and they can even be connected to robotic bodies that they learn to control. This research is raising ethical questions that were purely philosophical just a few years ago. If brain organoids develop sufficiently complex patterns of activity, might they have rudimentary forms of consciousness? How would we even know if they're conscious? These questions are no longer purely theoretical. They're becoming practical concerns that research ethics committees are grappling with today. The truth is even more shocking. These technological developments are converging with new theoretical insights that suggest consciousness might be even more fundamental to reality than we ever imagined. Recent research on the placebo effect has revealed that consciousness can directly influence physical healing processes in ways that challenge our traditional understanding of the mind-body relationship. When people believe they're receiving effective treatment, their brains can trigger real biochemical changes that promote healing. This suggests that consciousness isn't just a passive observer of physical processes, but can actively influence them. Dr. Fabrizio Benedetti at the University of Turin has spent decades studying the placebo effect and has found that it involves real neurobiological changes. When patients expect pain relief, their brains release natural opioids that actually reduce pain. When they expect their Parkinson's symptoms to improve, their brains release dopamine that actually improves motor function. These effects aren't just psychological, they're measurable changes in brain chemistry and physiology that can be as powerful as pharmaceutical drugs. This suggests that consciousness might have a more direct influence on physical reality than we've traditionally assumed. Studies of the mind-body connection have found that mental states can affect immune function, cardiovascular health, and even gene expression. Meditation, positive emotions, and social connection can literally change how our genes are expressed, while stress, negative emotions, and social isolation can have detrimental effects on physical health. Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize for her work on telomeres, has found that meditation can actually slow the aging process at the cellular level. Experienced meditators have longer telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with age, suggesting that consciousness-based practices can influence the fundamental biological processes of aging. These findings challenge the traditional separation between mind and body, consciousness and physical reality. They suggest that consciousness might be far more integrated with physical processes than we've traditionally assumed. The emerging field of consciousness studies is bringing together researchers from neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, physics, computer science, anthropology, and other disciplines to address these fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness. This interdisciplinary approach is revealing connections and insights that wouldn't be possible from any single perspective. The Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, founded in 1994, now brings together thousands of researchers from around the world who are working on different aspects of consciousness. Their annual conferences feature presentations on everything from the quantum mechanics of microtubules to the phenomenology of mystical experiences, from artificial consciousness to the consciousness of coma patients. Some researchers are developing new experimental paradigms for studying consciousness that go beyond traditional neuroscientific approaches. They're exploring how consciousness relates to creativity, meaning-making, spiritual experience, and other phenomena that are difficult to study in laboratory settings, but are central to human experience. The global connectivity provided by the internet and social media is creating new forms of collective consciousness and shared awareness that are unprecedented in human history. Some researchers are studying how individual consciousness relates to group consciousness, and whether technologies might eventually allow for direct sharing of conscious experiences between individuals. Dr. Thomas Metzinger at the University of Mainz has been exploring the possibility of creating shared virtual reality environments where multiple people can experience the same virtual body. These experiments are revealing how consciousness constructs our sense of self and how that sense might be altered or expanded through technology. These developments are not just advancing our scientific understanding of consciousness, they're changing how we think about what it means to be human, what kinds of beings deserve moral consideration, and how consciousness relates to the deepest questions about reality, meaning, and purpose. As we stand at the threshold of potentially creating artificial consciousness, enhancing human consciousness through technology, and perhaps even discovering consciousness in unexpected places throughout the universe, we're confronting questions that our ancestors could never have imagined. Yet in many ways, we're still asking the same fundamental questions that have puzzled humans since the beginning of consciousness itself. But perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Because consciousness isn't just a scientific problem to be solved, it's the very medium through which we experience wonder, beauty, love, and meaning. Every advance in our understanding of consciousness reveals new depths to the mystery, new questions to explore, new wonders to contemplate. As you listen to these words, your consciousness is performing an extraordinary feat. It's taking the vibrations in the air created by these sounds, transforming them into neural signals, integrating them with your memories and knowledge, and creating a meaningful experience of understanding. This process, which seems so effortless and natural, involves some of the most complex information processing in the known universe. And yet, behind all this complexity, there remains the simple, profound, inexplicable fact of being aware. The redness of red, the pain of pain, the joy of joy, these subjective qualities of consciousness remain as mysterious as ever, even as we map their neural correlates and understand their information processing functions. What nobody knew was that our journey into the deepest questions about consciousness was just beginning. Philosophical Twilight, the deepest questions, 40 minutes. And so we come to the deepest waters of our exploration, dear listener. Pour yourself another cup of tea, adjust your blankets, and settle in for what might be the most profound part of our journey together. Because now we must grapple with questions that touch the very heart of what it means to exist, to be aware, to be human. After centuries of investigation by the greatest minds in human history, consciousness remains as mysterious and wonderful as ever. But what have we learned from this grand adventure of human curiosity? What insights have emerged from our restless questioning, our careful observations, our bold theories? We've learned that consciousness is far more complex and multifaceted than our ancestors ever imagined. It's not a single thing, but a collection of processes: attention, awareness, self-reflection, sensory experience, emotional feeling, that somehow come together to create the unified stream of experience that defines what it's like to be you. But here's where it gets interesting. The more we learn about consciousness, the more we realize how much we don't know. Each answer reveals new questions. Each discovery opens new mysteries. It's as if consciousness is an infinite fractal of mystery, where every level of understanding reveals new depths to explore. We've learned that consciousness exists on a spectrum, from the simple awareness of basic organisms sensing light and moving toward it, to the rich, complex self-awareness of humans pondering their own existence. A bacterium swimming toward a food source shows a rudimentary form of awareness. A bird building a nest demonstrates more sophisticated consciousness. A chimpanzee recognizing itself in a mirror displays self-awareness. A human being contemplating the nature of consciousness itself represents perhaps the most complex form of awareness we know. Yet even this spectrum raises profound questions. Where exactly does consciousness begin? Is there something it's like to be a single-celled organism? What about a plant turning toward the sun? A computer processing information? The boundaries of consciousness remain frustratingly unclear, even as our understanding of its mechanisms becomes more sophisticated. We've discovered that consciousness can be altered, enhanced, diminished, and temporarily eliminated through various means, suggesting that it's produced by specific physical processes in the brain. Anesthetics can turn consciousness off like a light switch. Psychedelics can radically alter its contents and structure. Meditation can expand its boundaries. Brain injuries can fragment it in strange and revealing ways, but these very discoveries raise deeper questions. If consciousness can be so easily manipulated by physical interventions, what does this tell us about its nature? Are we nothing more than sophisticated biological machines, with consciousness as merely the software running on the hardware of our brains? Or is there something more to consciousness that transcends its physical substrate? But that was just the beginning. Because the deepest mystery of consciousness isn't just what it is or how it works, it's why it exists at all. We've found that consciousness might be far more fundamental to reality than we previously thought. Quantum mechanics suggests that observation plays a crucial role in determining physical reality. Theories like integrated information theory and panpsychism propose that consciousness might be a basic feature of the universe, present wherever information is integrated in the right way. Think about this for a moment. According to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, the universe exists in a state of infinite possibility until consciousness observes it and collapses those possibilities into a single reality. This would mean that you, right now, listening to these words, are actively participating in the creation of reality. Your consciousness isn't just observing the universe, it's helping to create it, moment by moment, through the act of conscious observation. This perspective suggests that consciousness isn't an accidental byproduct of evolution, but rather a fundamental feature of existence. In this view, the universe didn't accidentally give rise to consciousness. Consciousness is built into the very fabric of reality, and the universe is the stage upon which consciousness explores and knows itself. But even if consciousness is fundamental to reality, this doesn't resolve the deepest mystery, the mystery of subjective experience itself. Why is there something it feels like to be conscious rather than just sophisticated, unconscious information processing? How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? These questions touch on what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why there is something it feels like to be conscious. We can correlate conscious experiences with brain activity. We can understand the information processing functions of consciousness. We can even manipulate consciousness in precise ways. But we still don't understand why there should be any subjective experience associated with these processes at all. What happened then? How do we even begin to approach such fundamental questions? Some philosophers argue that the hard problem is genuinely hard, not just difficult to solve, but impossible to solve using our current conceptual frameworks. They suggest that we might need entirely new ways of thinking about reality, causation, and explanation to understand how consciousness relates to the physical world. Consider the nature of explanation itself. In science, we explain phenomena by showing how they arise from more fundamental phenomena. We explain the properties of water by appealing to the properties of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. We explain the behavior of living organisms by appealing to biological processes. We explain biological processes by appealing to chemistry by appealing to physics. But consciousness seems to resist this kind of reductive explanation. No matter how detailed our understanding of neural processes becomes, there seems to be an explanatory gap between objective brain activity and subjective experience. The redness of red, the pain of pain, the joy of joy, these qualitative aspects of consciousness seem to be something over and above the neural processes that give rise to them. This explanatory gap has led some philosophers to propose that consciousness might require a fundamentally new kind of science, one that takes subjective experience as a basic feature of reality, rather than something to be explained away. Just as physics had to develop new concepts like quantum mechanics to understand the behavior of subatomic particles, we might need to develop new concepts to understand consciousness. The truth is even more shocking. These philosophical challenges are not just abstract academic puzzles, they touch on the most practical and urgent questions about how we should live our lives. If consciousness is an illusion, as some materialist philosophers argue, then our sense of being conscious agents making free choices is also an illusion. We would be sophisticated biological machines following the laws of physics, with no genuine agency or responsibility for our actions. The feeling of making free choices would be just another neural process, no more real than a computer's decision to execute a program. But if consciousness is real and plays a genuine causal role in the world, then we might indeed be conscious agents capable of making genuine choices. Our decisions, our values, our sense of meaning and purpose might be more than just the inevitable result of prior causes. They might represent genuine creative acts in which consciousness participates in shaping reality. These questions about consciousness and free will have profound implications for how we think about moral responsibility, meaning, purpose, and the nature of human life. If we're just sophisticated biological machines, then concepts like guilt, praise, blame, and personal responsibility might need to be reconsidered. But if consciousness involves genuine agency, then these concepts remain central to human life. The mystery of consciousness also touches on questions about personal identity that are becoming increasingly practical as medical technology advances. What makes you, you? Is it your physical body, your memories, your personality, your consciousness itself? If your memories could be uploaded to a computer, would that digital copy be you? If your brain could be transplanted into another body, where would you be? These questions are no longer purely philosophical. As brain-computer interfaces become more sophisticated, as we develop better understanding of how memories are stored and retrieved, as artificial intelligence becomes more human-like, we're forced to confront practical questions about the nature of personal identity and consciousness. Consider a future scenario where it becomes possible to copy the exact pattern of neural connections in a person's brain and implement that pattern in an artificial substrate. Would the resulting artificial system be the same person, or just a copy? If both the original biological brain and the artificial copy exist simultaneously, which one is the real person? These questions challenge our most basic assumptions about what it means to be a person, what it means to survive death, what it means to be conscious. They force us to examine whether consciousness is tied to specific physical substrates, or whether it's more like a pattern that could, in principle, be implemented in different materials. But here's where it gets interesting. The mystery of consciousness also raises profound questions about our relationship to other forms of consciousness and to the universe as a whole. If consciousness is fundamental to reality, as some theories suggest, then we're not isolated islands of awareness in an unconscious universe. Instead, we're part of a larger tapestry of consciousness that might extend throughout the cosmos. The consciousness that looks out through your eyes might be connected in deep ways to the consciousness that looks out through other eyes, other minds, other forms of awareness. This perspective suggests that the boundaries between self and other, between individual and universe, might be more fluid than we typically assume. Mystics and contemplatives have reported experiences of expanded consciousness where the sense of separate self dissolves and awareness seems to merge with a larger cosmic consciousness. While such experiences are often dismissed as hallucinations or wishful thinking, they might actually be glimpses of a deeper reality where consciousness is more unified than our ordinary experience suggests. The practice of meditation and contemplation has long been a way of exploring these deeper dimensions of consciousness. When the chattering mind becomes quiet and the sense of separate self softens, what remains? Many practitioners report a sense of pure awareness, consciousness without content, awareness aware of itself. This pure awareness seems to be the ground from which all particular conscious experiences arise. It's the screen upon which the movie of your life plays, the space in which thoughts and feelings appear and disappear. Yet it's not itself a thought or feeling. It's the very capacity for consciousness itself. Some spiritual traditions suggest that recognizing this pure awareness is the key to understanding our true nature. From this perspective, we're not just isolated individuals struggling to survive in an indifferent universe. We're expressions of a universal consciousness that is exploring itself through countless individual perspectives. What nobody knew was that this mystical perspective on consciousness is beginning to converge with cutting-edge scientific theories about the nature of reality. Physicists studying the foundations of quantum mechanics have found that consciousness seems to play a fundamental role in the physical world. The universe doesn't seem to exist as a collection of definite objects with definite properties. Instead, it seems to exist as a field of possibilities that become actualized through the process of conscious observation. This suggests that consciousness isn't just something that emerges from the universe. It's something that participates in creating the universe. Every act of conscious observation is a creative act that helps determine what becomes real from the infinite field of quantum possibilities. If this interpretation is correct, then consciousness is not an accident but a necessity. The universe requires conscious observers to actualize its potential. Without consciousness, there would be no definite reality, only an endless field of unrealized possibilities. This participatory view of consciousness and reality suggests that we're not just passive observers of an independent universe, but active participants in its ongoing creation. Through our consciousness, the universe is literally coming to know itself. Consider the profound implications of this perspective. The consciousness that is reading these words right now isn't just a byproduct of cosmic evolution. It's a fundamental participant in the cosmic process. Through your awareness, the universe is becoming aware of itself. Through your understanding, the universe is coming to understand itself. Through your wonder and curiosity, the universe is exploring its own mystery. This view doesn't diminish the importance of scientific investigation. It reveals science as one of the ways consciousness explores and understands reality. Every scientific discovery is consciousness, discovering something new about itself and its world. Every moment of understanding is the universe coming to know itself more fully. But even this cosmic perspective on consciousness doesn't resolve the fundamental mystery. It only deepens it. Why should the universe be such that consciousness is necessary for its existence? Why should there be something rather than nothing? Why should that something be aware of itself? These questions touch on the deepest mysteries of existence itself. They're questions that science alone cannot answer, because they're questions about why there is a reality for science to study in the first place. They're questions that philosophy cannot definitively resolve, because they go beyond the reach of rational argument. They're questions that each conscious being must grapple with in their own way, in the depths of their own experience, but you'll never guess what it is. The deepest insight about consciousness might not be an answer at all, but rather a recognition of the profound mystery that consciousness represents. Perhaps the greatest discovery about consciousness is that it cannot be fully understood or explained in terms of anything else. Consciousness is irreducible. It's the one thing we know most intimately, yet it remains ultimately mysterious. We can study its mechanisms, map its neural correlates, understand its functions, even manipulate it in precise ways. But the essential mystery of what it's like to be conscious remains. This irreducibility of consciousness isn't a failure of science or philosophy. It's a recognition of something profound about the nature of reality itself. Consciousness might be one of those fundamental aspects of existence that cannot be explained in terms of more basic phenomena, because there are no more basic phenomena, like space, time, matter, and energy. Consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality that we must simply accept as given. But recognizing consciousness as irreducible doesn't mean giving up on understanding it. Instead, it means approaching consciousness with the wonder and humility that it deserves. It means recognizing that consciousness is not just a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Every moment of conscious experience is a miracle. The fact that there is something it's like to see a sunset, to hear music, to feel love, to contemplate the mystery of existence itself. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about the universe. It's a fact that we might never fully understand, but we can certainly appreciate it. Consider this moment right now. You are conscious. You are aware of these words, aware of your own thoughts and feelings, aware of being aware. This awareness that you're experiencing right now is the same awareness that has looked out through human eyes for thousands of years, the same awareness that might look out through countless other forms throughout the universe. This awareness is not something you have, it's something you are. You're not a separate self that possesses consciousness. You are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through the lens of a particular brain, a particular body, a particular life story. When you recognize this, something profound shifts. The consciousness that you are is the same consciousness that animates every other aware being. The awareness reading these words is the same awareness that watches sunsets, that loves and grieves and wonders, that creates art and music and poetry, that asks questions about the nature of existence. From this perspective, consciousness is not a problem but a gift. It's the gift of being able to experience beauty, to feel love, to know wonder, to participate in the ongoing creation of reality. It's the gift of being the universe conscious of itself. The truth is even more shocking. Perhaps the deepest truth about consciousness is that it transforms everything it touches, including our understanding of truth itself. Through consciousness, matter becomes alive. Through consciousness, the universe becomes beautiful. Through consciousness, existence becomes meaningful. Consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it transfigures reality, revealing dimensions of meaning, beauty, and value that wouldn't exist without conscious witnesses. Tomorrow, when you wake up, in that brief moment before memory floods back and the ordinary world reasserts itself, you might catch a glimpse of the extraordinary nature of consciousness itself. In that moment, you'll be experiencing what mystics and scientists, philosophers and poets have been trying to understand for thousands of years: the simple, profound, inexplicable miracle of being aware. But you don't need to wait until tomorrow. Right now, in this very moment, you are conscious. Right now, you are the universe aware of itself. Right now, you are participating in the deepest mystery of existence. Right now, you are enough. The mystery continues, and in a way, that's exactly as it should be. For consciousness is not just what allows us to experience mystery, it is itself the greatest mystery of all. Sweet dreams, fellow conscious beings. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams vivid. And when you wake tomorrow morning, remember that the consciousness that awakens with you represents something truly extraordinary in the cosmos. Rest well and dream beautifully. The universe is dreaming through you, and that dream is consciousness itself.